It's all a learning curve, you know. When I retired, I took on calligraphy and genealogy, and this is one of my family histories. I've also enjoyed collecting, mainly military helmets. Yep. I had a collection of 22, which has now been distributed throughout the family. The one in the corner is a helmet and a cuirass from the French cuirassiers, the heavy cavalry group of Napoleon. And this type of uniform and helmet were at Waterloo. I've also enjoyed reading a lot. My favourite author is Henry Lawson because he captures the heart of what was Australia at that time. And I'm very fond of music, but only classical music. I found some classical records in the barracks, and I remember now one of them was Mozart's Turkish March. I used to sit there and listen. No one else had listened to it. And you know, when I was a boy, I'd never ever heard of any classical music. It was only that time in Tokyo when I found the old 78 vinyl records. My name is Keith Thomas. I was born in the city of Adelaide in 1930. My mother's father, he was born here in Adelaide in 1858. My paternal grandfather arrived here in 1888 on the ship the Star of Greece, which came out from Liverpool in the UK and brought the cannons out for Fort Largs. My ancestral line in South Australia was comprised of Welsh, Cornish, German and Irish. My father worked as a miner. He went underground at Wallaroo Mines, working underground, pushing ore carts. He was 12 years old then. I attended school and there was no girls in my class. There was a boy class or a girl class. The girls didn't have the same playground as the boys when I was going to school. They had the boys' yard and the girls' yard. I sat down one day, not too long ago, and I wrote down the names of every boy that was in that class, where they lived, their address, their father's name, and what their fathers did in their occupation. You know, I remember George Clark. George Clark's father was a watchmaker. There was a bloke there called Jimmy Stewart. His father was a jockey, but he got banned for life from riding because he lost his licence as jockey because they found a battery in his whip. This was back in the 30s, you know, all these sort of things. One of my first jobs was at Penfolds Winery. I was very fortunate because when I got employed there, I was put to what they call the lab. And in charge of the lab was a chap called Max Hubert, who's famous with the Grange wine, because at that stage they hadn't even brought that wine onto the market. It was still in hogsheads. I remember it well because my job each morning was to go around and take the bung out of each hog, which they were quite numerous, and stir it 15 times, as Max Hubert used to tell me, not 13, not 17, but 15. I was offered the chance of being trained as a winemaker, but I declined it because I was dead set on becoming a soldier. I did join up and I had limited education, but I'd always had a yearning to learn. I had a great desire to read books, but I joined the army and they used to have an education test too. If you got A, you went straight into boot camp and started your 14 weeks training. I was fortunate enough to pass A and got in. It was an eye-opener when I went into recruit training, but I got through and liked it. And then I was told that would I like to go to Japan? And I thought, yeah, that sounds good. So I did. When we left Australia, it was, I believe it was March, and it was quite warm, so we were in our summer rig. But on arriving in Japan, it was winter and there was snow on the ground at the airfield we landed on, and then they forgot to send a truck down to pick us up. We eventually got there and then my duty in Japan started. There was a lot of things there that was still had the effects of the bombing and the devastation that took place at the end of the war. And of course, then when we got to our base, that was a special place because what they'd done, the Japanese were forced to make reparations after the war. One of the reparations was that they had to build the barracks for us, for the occupation troops. When I first went, I went to the 3rd Battalion, which was then considered to be the premier battalion in the Australian Army. It was all a bit of an adventure to me. There was many things that was really an eye-opener and quite different and quite impressionable when you were a young person of just 18 years old. We heard one day that we were restricted to barracks. There was no more leave, and that the armies of North Korea had invaded the Democratic Republic of South Korea. And we were not really trained to go into a system where we were going into a full-blown battle. So what happened, we went on a war footing straight away. And we were sent up into the mountains and went into really hard training. The day that I left for Korea with the rest of my mates, we went over on a ship called the Icon Victory, which was an American victory ship. They weren't supposed to know, but everyone seemed to know the day we were leaving. So the trucks were in convoy going from A to B, and all along that line were Japanese people waving. There was hundreds of them there just waving to us. And I remember, she was quite stoic. But we had a friend of ours there, a Japanese woman, who was a good friend of Ye, but she was crying. She was bawling her eyes out. And there was a lot of Japanese people there crying there, about there's the Australians that we knew so well, and they're leaving. They were my first impressions of Japan. Our regimental march was Sussex by the Sea, but our other march we had was a thing called Ringo, and it was a Japanese march, and I can still remember because it was. The band used to play it so often, and when we used to go down and the band would be playing this march, the Japanese kids would be singing, and I can still remember it. Okai no ringo ni kochibiru no sese dama ata mita iru arari sola. And I still remember it, things like that, because we never worried about, a lot of people said, oh, you're going to Japan, gee, that's going to be dangerous. But we had no fear whatsoever, or did we have any need for it? Because we always felt that we were in a safe environment. We spent one night getting from there across to Korea, because it's not very far from Japan to Korea. I was in the biggest battle in Korea, which was Kapyong, and we fought that battle on the 23rd and 24th of April. And we pulled out, withdrawal occurred the night of the 25th. In that battle, there was 66 South Australians, but I'm the only survivor now. Anyhow, after I spent my time there, I came back to Japan. So I actually virtually stopped in Japan for another 2 years. Ye and I had to get married. We didn't have to get married, we wanted to get married, but it was very hard to get married. And my son was born there. But as soon as he was born, we had to think about coming back to Australia. And our son was only 3 months old when we arrived here. Then I decided that I'd done enough time and I'd get out and look for something else. What happened then was that I was fortunate that I got a job at Pine Gap, the Joint Defence Facility just outside Alice Springs. But then I was offered a position as a ranger, which I'd always had that idea that I'd like to do, because as a kid I used to love to go camping, even if it was by myself. The position was that I had to go out and man a ranger station, which was a one-man thing. And the ranger station happened to be a caravan. That was my living quarters. And it was a very isolated area. I don't know if you're familiar with the Palm Valley. No. It's 14 kilometres south of Hermansburg, down the Fink River. You've got to cross the Fink River in a four-wheel drive track 7 times to get to where my camp was. So I went down there and I found this caravan that was pretty dilapidated, and I had to do a lot of work there. But anyhow, I spent 2 years there, and then I went from there back to Alice Springs, and then I was made Chief Ranger of the Alice Springs area. And I had a staff of about, I think it was about 16, 17. If I look back over my life, I would say the most enjoyable time that I experienced in my working period was as a Parks and Wildlife Ranger, because Army service is a regimented type of thing. You toe the line, you do the things, and you get promotions as they come along if you work for them. But the thing I liked about the Parks and Wildlife is that you got incentive to do things on individuality. Well, I'll tell you a story. I'm out at my first assignment. Every morning at 8:30, I'd have to go and switch my Kodan radio on in the caravan and listen for the Flying Doctor to come on. It was called the Flying Doctor Sked. And they would just come on and they'd call your call sign. And you'd have to reply and say, okay, everything's okay here. It was Easter. And the Flying Doctor's sister came on and said, has someone pressed the emergency call? And this chap came on and said, yes. And she said, can you identify yourself? And he did. And she said, what is your location? And he gave this remote location right out on the border of Western Australia, a track that virtually no one ever took. He said, I've come across a vehicle. And he said, I stopped to check the vehicle. He said, I found a body inside the vehicle. And it's funny. The sister said, what is the condition of the body? He said, oh, it's dead. She said, oh, well, this is not an emergency, is it? So anyhow, it worked out that this chap had come up along this track. He was an American who was teaching school in Adelaide, had no bush experience, who brought a brand new short wheel Toyota and had decided to go bush. And he'd come up along this track that hardly anyone ever went along. And he got a puncture, and of course he stopped, and he only had one spare, which is a wrong thing for a start. And he changed it, and he started to proceed, but then he got the second puncture. And so to cut a long story short, he perished there. And he was there 3 months, because they estimate that he died in January during the school holiday break, but he wasn't found till that Easter. But anyhow, that in November of that year, just laying down in my bed in the caravan, I looked out the window and I saw down the track some lights. I thought, now, where are these people going? So I got up and walked down the track with a torch, and I stopped them. I said, if you like to just turn here and go up about 50 metres where my caravan is, I said, I got a bit of lawn up there. I said, you can camp there for the night. And he said, yeah. I said, well, while you're doing that, I said, I'll put the billy on, we'll have a cuppa. I said, I feel like one too anyhow. So we got up and we was having this cuppa there, and he and this lass, and it came around to this bloke that perished. This chap said to me, he said, have you ever seen that vehicle there before? I said, what? He said, that vehicle of ours, the short wheelbase. I said, no. He said, that was the vehicle that bloke died in.
Wow.
I said, well, how did you get it? He said, we got it very cheap. I said, I can imagine that. That was just one thing. I had another one there where this chap and his wife came up to visit relatives in Ayers Rock, and whilst I was there, she died. I said, what are we going to do? So then I found out that at that time these motels had all closed because Ulara, Ulara there, that was open then, so they closed all those motels. But I found out they had an old cold room at the Inland Hotel. So I got my mechanic that was there, a bloke called John Beasy. I got him to come down and check it over, and he said, oh, we can get this going. He said, but it's not going to run for long. I said, okay, get it going, John. So we did. So what we had to do is we had to take this poor woman's body down there and put it in this cold room. Many things like that, things that you wouldn't find in cities. City people would never think of would occur. So that made the job very interesting against other jobs. And as I said, you got the initiative to do things. Well, I look back today, what type of bloke was I as a senior ranger and that. And I still have my rangers come here to visit me from the Rock. I have them ring me up to see how I'm going. So I've still got relationships, and good ones, you know, and they keep in touch with me. And I don't have many army mates because, as I've told you, I was in the biggest battle in Korea, which was Kap Yong. So those contemporaries of mine at that time they're just memories. That's in the War Museum in Wellington, New Zealand.
Can I take it down?
Yeah, certainly. And this was painted, and it was commissioned last year. And this chap here, they modelled him off of me, because on the back of the hat, the artisans take the liberty of putting Tomo on the back of the puggaree of the hat. So my offside of there was a bloke called Squizzy Taylor. All tailors are called Squizzy in the army. And, chaps like him and another bloke that's just died a few years ago in Ireland, Tommy Sinnott, we were just ordinary riflemen. I was on the Bren gun, but I was still classed as a rifleman. And those sort of blokes, they're not only mates, but I thought I was closer to them than I was to my brothers at the time. Because when you're in a situation like this, your life depends on them. You depend on them so much and they depend on you. And you have the greatest respect. And they're more in your memories than anyone else, really, as far as friendship goes. And this painting here was probably one of the worst, because that chap there, the New Zealand officer who was a range officer giving the rangers for the guns, he was killed that day. It was the biggest battle, and it's the biggest battle the Australians fought, and we were the first foreign unit to be awarded the United States Presidential Citation. This is the top citation of all the citations in decorations of the America. It's the top one. It's like the Victoria Cross of citations, and it was awarded to us. And I'm the only one in South Australia now that can wear it. I have very good memories of that side of my service. And but unfortunately, I'm the only one left now, and what I'd like to know is, in the battalion, there was about 700 of us in the battalion. I'd like to know how many are left now. Not many. One in South Australia, that's me. I don't know how many there is. But it's just part of my growing up, and I wouldn't say it was the best part, but the mateship certainly was. And I don't think, just for philosophising for a while, I don't think that ordinary people know or can experience the depth of that friendship, that kinship, that mateship that soldiers develop. I don't think they can. Unless you experience it, you can't. I remember when I first went into battle training, even when I was during the end of boot camp, they were trying to instill in you what you were, that you were a soldier. And, that they'd scream at you, "What are you? What's your main aim in life?" And of course you'd have to scream back, "And to kill the enemy." And they'd, they try to instill a disregard for the other side, but it's hard. And one of the hardest things I had to do, and I've told you about this, was when I first went into action. The first action I was ever involved in, which was about 2 weeks after we arrived in Korea, and being in a position, and we weren't doing it, we were getting fired at by North Koreans, and we had mortar bombs and small arms fire coming in amongst us. What stunned me was the fact, because I found out I was not really trained to that standard they needed at that stage, because I kept on saying to myself, what are those buckets firing at us for? Because, you know, I couldn't envisage anyone looking to do harm to us, deliberately do harm to us. And it took a while to sink in, and then all of a sudden my training did sink in. And that was the enemy, and you've got to do something about it. It's a long learning curve, but you either do it or you don't survive. Yeah. When we're in Korea, even in the wintertime, you're out in the open. You bedded down each night in your sleeping bag. I remember there was a time where it rained for 3 days and we used to climb into our sleeping bags, saturated, wet, and the sleep that you got. And then what would happen was you'd get out in the morning and you'd be steam right off of your body, but everything would be damp and cold and wet still. And a lot of things depends, once again, on your mate. You know, that with him, you and him, you dig the weapon pit together, and you share your rations, and anything. I mean, even when things get low, you wouldn't see your mate go without a drink. I met Ye, she worked for 34 Brigade, and she worked there as a telephonist. Anyhow, things worked out and we got together, and then I went to Korea. I came back and our son was born and we came back home. But, you know, I've got, even though I get very frustrated with her condition these days, we've been married 74 years, and I've got the greatest pride and time for her, because what she did was really remarkable. She decided that she was going to come to Australia, which is completely foreign to her in language, in food, in custom, and all of that. And she was going to bring a 3-month-old baby, and she did. And she made the best of it. And we got back in 53. Now, that was only 8 years after the end of the war, and there was a hell of a lot of animosity in this country against the Japanese, and you couldn't blame them, because people had relatives and friends and that, and sons and husbands that had been prisoners of war and treated very, very badly. So you couldn't blame them. But she handled that the best she could, and I supported her. And even my son, he encountered it when he went to school. I had a bit of trouble when I started off in life, because I love books. I've always had a passion for books. And I used to buy a lot of books and I'd take them home. I had quite a little library. Yeah. And, but my dad was never a man for education. And so I came home one day, all my books had disappeared. And I'd made up a little bookcase and all for them. Yeah. And I had to hide them. But all my books disappeared and I had to start all over again. So anything that come around, I'd pick it up and I'd read. And my dad used to go, you know, you're wasting your life. Really? And he was, you know, he wasn't the person that you'd answer back to, so I kept my mouth shut and just got on with it. I left school at year 7. I loved Shakespeare's Richard III. You know, like now as the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon a house now buried in the deep bosom of the ocean. I can go through them and several other verses. I can go through his sonnets, his 18th sonnet and all that. friend of mine, this John Harcourt, he was like me, and a bloke called Dean Rugby. We found out that they were having Richard III at the Old Royal Theatre in Hindley Street. And the person that was performing Richard III was Sir Laurence Olivier, wasn't Sir Laurence in that? His wife was Vivian Lee. Yeah. So I said to John, what about we go along? So we didn't have much money, but to get in, we went there at, say, 5 o'clock the night before, and we sat on the footpath all night until they open up in the morning, till we could get a ticket. But at 11 o'clock that night, where they're a bit dreamy and that, who should come walking down? His wife in a fur stole and him, but Laurence Olivier and Vivian Lee. And they walked along the line. I remember him saying to us, I remember him saying, how long have you been here? And I told him, and of course in his accent and that. And so anyhow, we met him and we met Vivian Lee there. I always remember when I was in Korea, there was a lot of bad times there when I used to think about being out there in the front line and thinking what's going to happen tomorrow. But the worst part of it, I reckon the worst part of my service on those situations was there laying down on the ground waiting for that whistle to blow, which meant up and start moving forward. You'd have details, what was your objective within that. But that was, to me, that waiting was the most terrible time of the whole lot. It wasn't bad when you got up and started moving, because your objectivity came into it and you were going to try and attempt something. But when you're just laying there, you're starting to, your mind wanders. You've got to have a bloody sense of humour too. You've got to try and raise a smile every now and then, even though things are looking down and that. And that takes a lot of doing at times. At Cap Yong, we got bombed by the Americans with napalm. Well, that was an eye-opener to me, because Jack McBride, who I went through boot camp with, he got killed with that bomb. He was one of 5 that got killed. But there was another bloke that later became a casualty. We kept him alive until we got back to the Middlesex. All we gave him was morphine. But he walked out of where the second bomb had dropped. His boots were smouldering. The skin on his arm had come down and formed over his hands, so there was skin just coming down from his hands, like someone had got it and just pulled it down. His singlet was still smouldering, his singlet under his shirt, nothing left of his shirt. No eyebrows and all that. And Harold said, for Christ's sake, sir, shoot me, for God's sake. So anyhow, I get a bit emotional. But anyhow, the company commander said, look, don't worry, old fella, we're going to get you out of here. So we did that night. We carried him out, 4 to a stretcher. We'd taken turns. We carried him out about 5 miles over ridge lines and that, and we got him out to the middle, but he died the next day. But, you know, those sort of things, they're eye-openers. And I get a bit emotional over those sort of things, because they're all good mates. It's worse when you're a young bloke, 18 years old, because there's a lot of things in life you don't even know about. But there you are, up doing one of the worst things that humankind can commit themselves to. We had no way of getting rid of our wounded out of Cap Yong until we had to have ammunition. We were running low. So the American 77th Tank Battalion, who was our armour support, said they'd bring the ammunition forward. And we told them, you've got to break through because we're encircled at the moment. So they said, leave it to us. So they got ammunition and they came through and they broke through. We loaded wounded on them. Those that could, we got inside the tank. We couldn't get many, 1 or 2. and then the stretchers we put on the back where the engine is. And so anyhow, our medics put a couple of Red Cross flags up. And as I was going out, the Chinese, we weren't in contact with the North Koreans yet. The Chinese saw what was happening and they stopped firing. There was no word said. They stopped firing, and we knew that they were saying, okay, go through, take your wounded out. We had a bloke captured at Kapyong, and he got awarded the highest award beside the Victoria. He got the George Cross. But when they awarded it, he was dead because he was taken prison. He was in a North Korean prison camp, and he wouldn't bow down to him. He used to keep telling him, get stuffed, get stuffed, get stuffed. And they beat him and beat him and beat him and starved him, and in the end he died. But they gave him the George Cross for it. So that just points to the savagery of war. You could not survive without that mateship. You could not. You know, the thing about it is, that is not part, well, it is part, but it should not be a part of our existence as a human being. But it is, it's probably one of the most common parts of us, but it shouldn't be. And to really experience and to see the futility in it and the savagery that goes on at times, and then at the same time you've got to have a heart too. During the battle, in the latter parts, I heard some shots going on. Things had been quiet for a while, and I got up and I peeped over the parapet, and there was this Chinese bloke coming up there, and there was blokes trying to shoot him. And I remember Squizzy yelling out, hey, knock it off, the poor bastard's trying to give up. Because he had his hands in the air, you see. He was only about 50 metres away at that time. I said, come on, Johnny, come on, up this way. And I said, go, knock it off, come on, give him a go. So anyway, he come up and we grabbed him and put him in our pit. And he was only a young bloke, 16, 17. I gave him a packet of cigarettes, and Squizzy and I broke open one of our sea rations and gave to him. And I don't think he'd eaten for a while. The poor bugger was scoffing it down, you know. This is the thing, why it's so bloody futile. But when we were carrying the wounded out, like Harold Giddens and that, this little bloke walked over from this group of prisoners that we had sitting on the ground and grabbed my pack, and he put it on. So as we moved, he started moving with us, carrying my pack for me, because I was on one end of a stretcher, and when one of the saddest moments when we got to the Pakhan River, we had to get these. There was more than 30 prisoners there then, but we had to get them, and so they had to go back to a different area, a prisoner detachment. And this little bloke was still carrying my pack, and I said, hey, Johnny, give us my pack, mate, give us my pack. And he didn't want to give it to me, and he sort of gesticulating and saying, yeah, I'll come with you, I'll carry your pack, And I was saying, no, hey, Johnny, give us my bloody pack. And eventually he didn't. As I looked around, and he was like a dog, tearful sort of, wasn't tearful, but that hang look he had on him. But I often wondered, what happened to him? So, there's a bit of civility, if you can call it that. That's the thing you should never lose too. You know what's going to happen to you if you drop your guard, but you don't have to be a beast with what's left of it. So it's all a learning curve,